morning, everyone. I am Sara Espinosa, Manager of Training and Development at the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. Thank you for joining us today for our 13th Annual College Changes Everything Conference. Joining us today is Dr. Susie Weiss, who is the author of Design for Belonging. Dr. Susie Weiss is a designer and teacher with experience in the education, tech, and social sectors. She coaches leaders in innovation practices, equity design, and storytelling for inclusion, is the founder and former director of the K-12 Lab Network at the Stanford D School, is currently an adjunct professor at the D School, and is a co-creator of Liberatory Design. Susie will be joined in conversation today by Edith Jaguna. Edith is the director of the Illinois Education and Career Success Network, a collaborative of communities across the state that is driving improved outcomes for young people. The network was created in 2013 by Advance Illinois, Education Systems Center at NIU, and ISAC to support communities to increase meaningful and equitable post-secondary attainment. Thank you both for being here. Edith, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I would like to kick us off by talking about the term belonging. And I know that the term has been used a lot in the last few years, but it's less common to hear about designing for belonging. We have participants from various sectors at this conference, from secondary to post-secondary, nonprofit, state agencies, and other sectors who all serve students in different contexts. Susie, could you please define what you mean by designing for belonging, especially in the context of serving Black, Brown, and students from other underrepresented communities?
Thank you, Edith and Sarah, and thanks for everyone for the beautiful work that I know you're doing here in this conference. So belonging, we know, is a fundamental human need, and it is especially important for one to develop their identity as a learner and to be able to persevere when things are tough. Given that we know that about belonging, the work that I'm trying to do is to remind us that we cannot design belonging. It's a feeling. Any individual is going to have it in their own way, in their own places. But we can design all kinds of things that help belonging to emerge. And so the work of designing for belonging is reminding us to take an active role and really dig into how we are creating our learning environments, how we are creating pathways, and particularly, as you raised, for the most vulnerable populations in any given context. And we know that in education, that is often our young Black and Brown folks. And so creating belonging, designing for it to emerge, is the move to say their belonging really matters. And I want to investigate what's standing in the way of that. Sometimes the things that are standing in the way are very subtle. They're things that set up microaggressions. They're the lack of a concrete invitation. And beyond the invitation to a space, how does it actually feel when you arrive there? Do you have any evidence that you're really supposed to be there? That's what we're doing when we're designing for belonging, is building in the environmental cues, the concrete programmatic components that help people know that they do in fact belong. That's the work of Design for Belonging.
Great, thank you for that. And you alluded to this a little bit, but I appreciate the way you outline moments of belonging in your book, which everyone in the audience will get. And you provide very specific examples of designing for each of these moments, from the invitation to exiting. Since not everyone has read the book yet, could you please share some highlights from some of the moments and talk about ways that people incorporate them in their work?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that question. The work that I'm doing, when we think about designing for belonging, the reason that I want us to talk about moments is you can't actually design in abstract or kind of all at once or in general. You really have to think about whose experience you're centering and then get to concrete experiential moments to design. What I do in the book, and thank you to all of you for checking it out. The book is to say, these are 9 moments that I think really matter for belonging. I also offer you the invitation to think about, what are the moments specifically in your context? But the moments in general are the invitation, the entering. What does it look like to fully join in and participate in a context? I also talk about code switching. How do we notice what kinds of identities are coming forward and what might be suppressed? A really important piece of belonging is the moment of contribution. So, how do we design for someone's voice to really show up, or for them to make a contribution to the work at hand, to share who they are as part of an exploration? There are lots of different ways that we can think about the moment of contribution, but it's a really critical one. I also talk about the moment of dissent. And this is drawing on the work of John Powell, which, if you're interested in othering and belonging, I really suggest you pursue his work. But thinking about the fact that it is when we make demands in a context that we actually can see whether or not we're really supposed to be there. Do we really belong? I think dissent is a powerful moment also to investigate almost as a measure of belonging. Because think about it, you're not going to bother to offer feedback if you're not trying to be a part of something. That brings up another moment, which is participating. What we're trying to get to when we design for belonging is to get to full participation. And then finally, this moment of, I call it in the book, diverging and exiting. That's to remind us that belonging is not a zero sum game. We are often, and especially in educational contexts, right? We're coming in and out for real and important reasons. And we want to know that that doesn't impact whether or not we can belong or not. If we need to pursue a slightly different path, how can that be accepted? How do we envision and support people to still belong, even if they need to pursue a slightly different path? So, again, these moments of belonging are to get us to that really concrete notion of designing for belonging. And the invitation that I like to think about is to sketch out, what do you think are your main programmatic moments? And which ones are really strong moments of belonging, and for whom? Right? Because we sometimes create moments of belonging that make some people feel that they belong and actually inadvertently make other people feel like maybe they don't. And what we're trying to do is avoid that kind of threat of not belonging in our designs. But the invitation is to think about, what are your moments of belonging? Maybe you need to focus on the invitation, the entering, the contributing, and the offering of dissent. Those might be 4 moments to really focus on.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful in having very specific areas that folks can focus on in order to really use belonging effectively. I was excited when I was asked to have this conversation with you and realized that you are one of the designers of liberatory design mindsets. I'm based at Education Systems Center at NIU, and we have incorporated the mindsets into our team meetings to ensure that we're consistently centering equity in all our project spaces. At each team meeting, team members are invited to identify a mindset that they will focus on in their project the following month. Could you say a little bit about the mindsets and how they support teams to design for belonging?
Absolutely, absolutely. The mindsets, there are now 12 mindsets in liberatory design, and they are to help us as we're trying to do design, and particularly in this case, if we're talking about designing to build greater belonging in our community or in our programs. These mindsets are to help tune and pay attention to our equity lens. They're also a reminder that we're always working in the context of complexity. And finally, that we are doing the work of design. And one of the mindsets related to design that I think is really important to consider is to exercise your creative courage. So the mindsets, I'll say them out loud for you. Build relational trust, practice self-awareness. This is, of course, incredibly important for any equity-based work, but it's also important for any kind of community building. Recognize oppression, can't do our work without bringing that lens, our equity lens, to understand what is oppressive and what is not in this system, and again, for whom. Embrace complexity. So that's the thinking about the fact that things are always going to be emergent, that we can't just plan our way forward. Plans are great, but then we need to launch prototypes, pilots, probes to really understand how things are working. The focus on human values, this comes from human-centered design, and this is an orientation towards really empathizing with others that are like you and that are not like you, and digging in. And then related to that is seeking I'm seeking liberatory collaboration. So how are we learning to work across difference? I won't go through them all, but I will say that the ones that we added to this kind of toolkit after our initial start with the work were work with fear and discomfort, attend to key healing, work to transform power, and exercise creative courage. Those last four are really important for digging into the work of equity building, particularly if you're trying to build teams that are across difference in important ways.
Thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about data. So we know that data provide critical information to help educators and others identify where they're making progress and where more work is needed. You write about some educators you worked with who moved away from looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as a technical problem to be solved through data and numbers to seeing it as a relational opportunity to connect with people in their communities. Could you say more about this?
Absolutely, absolutely. Part of the experience I've had, and this was working with school leaders from across the country, and I can tell a specific story that's coming to mind. But first, I'll just say that part of what I saw was that thinking about belonging, that feeling that we're actually going for when we do our work in diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important. That sometimes, if we're just looking at numbers, we forget that the numbers are actually stories of real people. And so the move of human-centered design is actually to get us to that space of understanding people's real stories. And the work of design for belonging then is really situating us, reminding that we're going for that really human experience of getting to belonging. It's not just about numbers. So one way to think about it is diversity is a fact, equity is a goal, inclusion practices are how we get there, but belonging is the feeling that we're seeking for every individual, especially those furthest from opportunity to get to experience in our learning environments. So that move is really important from the technical of just the data to really understanding what the experiences are that people are having. It can also be really motivating for us and our teams when we get to that more personal relational work. It can also be scary. So let's be clear about that. I'll tell a story about a leader that I worked with. He was a new assistant principal in a large public school in the Denver area in Colorado. And he was new to this school as an assistant principal. He's been an assistant principal before, but he was coming into a new school. And as they were doing their summer planning, like everyone is right now, he was thinking about, well, what kind of community convenings, assemblies might we be having this year? And the principal said, oh, no, we don't do that here. We can't. And he thought, wow, okay, like what's that about? That seems like sad, confusing, etc. And it motivated him to think about where people really were. And he had an idea that if kids knew how to get along better, of course, then that was what was holding them back from being able to do these larger, more communal things. And he started by also recognizing that the educators at the school didn't have much in the way of relationships. So he decided to start with them. And he built a pretty scrappy curriculum of just experiences that the educators, so the adult community, had coming together to get to know each other, and to start to build their trust. And once they started to get to know each other and build better relationships, then they wanted that. What he saw was, then they wanted that for their students too. And they took up the notion of using advisory, and they built collaboratively new curriculum so that student groups could start to get to know each other in a space that was not explicitly academic all the time, but also was supporting their academics. And they did this work of building a new advisory program so that those small groups had the relationships that then, in fact, they could come together. And he built it around doing a large communal puzzle. You could imagine it could also be about around service projects, community building, etc. But the school, because they started with the relationships of the adults, then they worked with small groups of students, they were able, in fact, to get to that place of bringing the whole community together and accomplishing something together. That then, in fact, changed the data of their school. But it was because he made that move from not just thinking about, who got expelled and who was struggling with going to particular kinds of events, but really thinking about what would it take on a human level for people to be able to come together. So that to me is just an example of reminding ourselves that any data we have has a human side, and that often when we dig into that, that is also the thing that then spurs our creativity and reminds us why we're really doing this work to begin with.
That really resonates with me. And I know that several communities across the state have been looking at data and thinking about changes that they need to make to their work, and what the data is telling them. But many of them are also thinking about how to engage students so that they can figure out what the data says, what the students see in the data, and how student voice can be incorporated in the work as they move forward.
I love that. If it's okay, I'll just follow up to say that's so important. And by the way, students themselves can look at data, right? It's not a magical thing that we should put on the shelf and not be engaged with, right? That's a really interesting thing to do with students in a relational way. Wow, we have this data. What do you think that means to you? Right? Because data is just for the purpose of moving us forward. It wants to get investigated, and particularly young minds who aren't just used to seeing the report year after year in a particular way. Well, think about the kind of creativity that they could bring to that. So I love the way you're linking that up with the role of student voice. And I think that could even be designed to be tackled pretty directly.
Great. So Dr. Arlene Geronimus, in her 40 years of research on the topic, notes that othering accelerates aging and disease among marginalized groups. So if we in education are not designing for belonging, we are contributing to this public health crisis. Furthermore, mental health concerns, especially among young people, have been highlighted since the pandemic. What are ways that designing for belonging helps address mental health and other health issues?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And also, thank you for reminding us that we're in this moment post pandemic. I think it's really important to think about where we are and keep engaging in this conversation of recovery and repair. One of the other moments of belonging, we didn't talk about it when I was laying out the moments, but one of the other key moments to design for is repair. How do we recover? And I think we're in a moment, kind of culture wide, but certainly in any particular school culture, where we can do greater work to speak directly to this moment and investigate, how do we repair? Because the only way to get to healing, and this can be from historic wrongs in terms of racial inequities, that can be recovery from the thing that is the pandemic. But to get to healing, we have to engage in repair. And that is something to design for. It doesn't happen on its own. And so whether we're thinking about just the culture of the school or explicit mental health concerns, designing for the moment of repair is incredibly important too for mental health outcomes. And we know that belonging is both a contributor to supportive mental health and the other way around. So it is really important to take it up. And I think the lens of designing for repair is a really powerful way to think about that. I worked with some educators. They were in Northern California in Humboldt County. And I spent a week there. We're doing work at kind of all different ages around designing for belonging. And what I kept noticing was the kind of elephant in the room of the pandemic. We are, of course, so happy to be in a moment where people are not getting sick as much as they were, although of course it does exist, that we're not, sheltering in place anymore, etc. And so this rush to kind of try to normalize is very important and very real and very human. And I think it's an elephant in the room that we just haven't fully recovered from that experience. And so calling it out and doing some work around designing what kind of healing opportunities do educators need? What have people been through that they might want to repair and change in order to move forward? The summer is a really powerful time to do that work and to set up for the fall so that we have spaces and tools and ways to access that important repair and healing work. I think is a really it can be a really important way to think about the mental health pieces. And when we talk about mental health, we want to talk about the mental health of our young people, but also of our educators who carry so much of it.
Thank you. Thank you for your really thoughtful and provocative remarks. I look forward to testing the ideas in the book, and I'm sure many in our audience are eager to do the same. Do you have any advice for those in the room about some ways that we might test those ideas?
Sure. Well, I'm excited that you all are going to do some exercises. I would say it's a moment to lean into that liberatory design mindset of exercise creative courage. The work that you're doing today, A, it really matters, and B, it wants to be an expression of your creativity. And so if you have to push yourself to try a sketch, try an improv exercise, try a way that you just let yourself know it's okay. You're in a safe space. You are a learner too. Try on these tools and see where they can take you because they're very open-ended purposefully, but you get better by trying more kind of revolutions of them, more iterations of using these tools. You'll get to some different places. So my advice is to try and to keep trying. And remember that your belonging matters too. So the simple tool of the emotional journey map, where are your moments of belonging, highs and lows, is a useful tool, I think, for everyone. And you might think about using that with your teams, your teachers, etc. So I wish you a great rest of your convening, and I'm excited to hear how you dig in and use these tools.
Thank you again, Susie, and really appreciate you writing the book and offering those words of advice.
Thank you. Thank you, Edith, and the whole team.